In 2012, Samantha Roth vanished during a secluded mountain retreat, her disappearance dismissed as a troubled woman walking away from her life. For 8 years, her family received no answers until a wildfire tore through the forest, revealing a hidden trapdoor beneath the cabin floor. What investigators uncover ignites a chilling hunt through journals, buried chambers, and a man who used healing as a mask for control. As Samantha's sister reopens the case, long-buried secrets rise with the smoke, and the mountain finally begins to give up its dead. The wildfire had burned for 3 days before it reached the ridge where the old mountain retreat stood. From the air, the cabins looked like fragile matchboxes scattered among the pines, each one swallowed by a wall of orange and black. By the time the flames passed, there was nothing left but chimneys, skeletal frames, and a layer of gray ash so thick it muffled footsteps. The air still shimmered with heat as crews moved in to search for flare-ups, their boots crunching over charred beams and melted glass. Near the largest cabin, a firefighter paused. Beneath the wreckage, the floor had caved in, revealing something that had not been touched by fire. It was a square of dark metal, soot-stained but intact, set into a base of concrete. At first it looked like a hatch from an old storm shelter, but the handle was heavy steel and there was no visible lock. Another firefighter knelt beside him and tapped it with the blunt end of a shovel. The sound was hollow, echoing in a way that made the air shift with unease. They began clearing away debris, peeling back layers of charred planks and warped nails until the edges of the trapdoor were visible. The ground around it was black and cracked, as if heat had tried and failed to burn through. Someone radioed the incident commander, saying they might have found a storage space. But when a crowbar was wedged under the edge and the hatch groaned open, the smell that rose out of the darkness was not of old supplies. It was damp, stale, and laced with something metallic. The beam of a flashlight caught the edge of concrete steps leading down into the earth. Soot drifted in the beam like dust in a forgotten attic. No one spoke for a long moment. Then the first firefighter, his voice quiet despite the roar of distant wind, said there was something else inside. Lying on the top step was a silver locket, half buried in ash. When he brushed it clean, faint initials came into view. S.R. He didn't know the name, but years earlier, those same letters had been printed on missing posters tacked to trees all along this mountain road. Detective Elena Cruz arrived at the scene just after sunrise, the mountains still wrapped in a thin veil of smoke that made the air taste like old firewood. The road to the retreat had been closed for years, but now it was a single-lane path cut by bulldozers, winding past blackened trees that stood like charred sentinels. She stepped out of her vehicle, boots sinking slightly into the ashy soil, and took in the remnants of the main lodge. It was hard to imagine this place once drew people looking for peace. The firefighters had kept the hatch uncovered, its blackened metal surface damp from the misting hoses that still ran along the perimeter. A paramedic handed her an evidence bag containing the locket, its surface smeared with soot but the initials still visible. Elena turned it over in her palm, noting the hinge, the fine clasp, the way it felt warm despite the morning chill. She had seen this before, though not in person. 8 years earlier, the same locket had been in a photo that made its way through every police department in the state, pinned to every bulletin board, printed on hundreds of flyers. She crouched near the opening, shining her flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing narrow concrete steps descending into a small room. Even from here, she could see scorch marks along the walls where smoke had seeped in, but the contents remained untouched by flame. A plastic chair sat against one wall, one leg broken. There was a table with a stack of notebooks that appeared warped from water, and in the far corner, a bundle of fabric that was too still to be anything alive. The crew had stopped exploring after the first few minutes. The moment they saw bones, they backed out and waited for her team. Elena inhaled slowly, filling her lungs with the cold air, before motioning to the forensics unit. They began their work in silence, cameras flashing in bursts of white light that made the underground space look like it had been caught mid-breath. As she stood back, Elena found her eyes drifting to the locket again. It was as if the initials had been waiting, patient and quiet, for someone to come looking. And now that they had been found, there would be no turning away from what lay beneath this mountain. 8 years earlier, the mountain had been alive with color. It was late September when Samantha Roth arrived at the retreat, her car packed with hiking boots, notebooks, and the thick wool sweater her sister had given her for her birthday. She had booked a week away from the city, hoping the quiet would help her reset after months of long work hours and a breakup that had left her with more questions than closure. The retreat itself was tucked into a slope of tall pines and golden aspens, the cabins simple but inviting, each with a view of the valley. There were other guests scattered among them, couples and small groups, but Samantha's cabin was set apart, close enough to the trails she planned to explore. The owner, a man named Harold Kinney, greeted her in the parking area with a handshake that lingered just a moment too long. His smile was pleasant, but his eyes had the kind of stillness that left her unsure whether he was truly seeing her or measuring her. On her second evening, she sat on the deck watching the sun dissolve into the ridgeline, the air cool enough to see her breath. A few other guests had gathered near the fire pit by the main lodge, their laughter carrying faintly through the trees. She considered joining them, but the solitude felt like a rare luxury. She poured tea into her travel mug, wrapped the sweater around her, and watched the first stars appear. Later, when she stepped inside, she noticed the sound of footsteps on the gravel outside. They slowed near her door, then moved away toward the main path. She told herself it was another guest, maybe lost in the dark, but when she checked the porch the next morning, she saw something strange. Near the steps, in the dirt, was a single boot print that didn't match her own shoes. It was the first detail her sister would remember when Samantha failed to come home, the first piece of a timeline that would grow tangled and thin over the years. And now, as the hatch in the burned cabin yawned open to the cold mountain air, that print seemed like the first faint echo of what had been hiding here all along. The morning Samantha was last seen began with a sky so clear it seemed carved from glass. She had planned to hike the East Trail, a winding path that climbed steadily toward an overlook known for its sweeping views. At breakfast in the lodge, she chatted briefly with another guest, a woman named Claire, who remembered Samantha mentioning she wanted to take photographs from the ridge. Claire would later recall that she seemed calm, almost glowing, as if the mountain air had worked some quiet magic on her. Harold Kinney served her coffee and asked about her plans for the day. He offered to point her toward a lesser-known shortcut to the overlook, one that, he said, would take her past a hidden waterfall. Samantha thanked him but politely declined, saying she liked the challenge of the full trail. Kinney smiled, though something about it made her glance away. By mid-morning she was gone, a small figure moving along the narrow trail with her camera swinging from its strap. The last confirmed sighting came from a father and son who passed her near mile 3. She waved, wished them a good hike, and continued upward. They assumed she had reached the overlook as planned. When she didn't return by nightfall, staff at the retreat checked her cabin. The bed was unmade, her sweater draped over the chair, her tea mug still half full on the counter. Her car was parked exactly where she had left it. Search teams were called in before midnight, combing the trail with flashlights that cut through the darkness in narrow beams. For 3 days they searched the mountain. Helicopters hovered low over the ridges, dogs picked through underbrush, volunteers swept the trails in grids. Nothing was found. No torn clothing, no broken equipment, no sign of an animal attack. It was as if she had stepped off the path and vanished into the air itself. Her family pressed for answers, but as weeks passed, the investigation thinned. The retreat reopened the following season, the cabins filled with new guests, and the questions surrounding Samantha Roth began to settle into the kind of silence that only deep woods and high mountains can hold for years without giving anything back. By the time the official search was called off, Samantha's sister, Julia, had already memorized every bend in the East Trail. She had walked it with volunteers, retraced it with search dogs, and later, alone, when the crews had gone and the mountain was left to its own quiet. Julia refused to believe her sister had simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements. Samantha had been cautious, careful, the kind of hiker who carried more water than she needed and checked the weather twice before leaving. Julia kept a binder in her apartment filled with maps, interview transcripts, and photographs. One page held a printout of the last known sighting, a grainy shot from a hiker's phone that showed Samantha walking away from the camera, her dark hair pulled into a braid, a blue backpack sitting squarely between her shoulders. In the background was a break in the trees, the faint suggestion of a side path no one could later place on any official map. Over the years, Julia emailed county sheriffs, forest rangers, even private investigators. Some responded politely, others not at all. A few agreed to look into the case, but each time the trail went cold within weeks. She started to hear the same phrases repeated back to her: no sign of foul play, no evidence to pursue, case remains open but inactive. Every so often, someone would report finding something on the mountain, a scrap of fabric, a water bottle, an earring, but nothing ever matched Samantha's belongings. Julia kept track anyway, building a list of all the almost clues that had led nowhere. The retreat continued to operate in the summers, though Julia could never bring herself to visit. Just the thought of walking past Cabin 4 made her chest tighten. 8 years passed like this, the search shrinking to something private, almost ritualistic. Julia would still check satellite images of the area, still read weather reports and trail updates as if one day a headline might break the silence. When the wildfire came, she followed the news with the same grim focus she had once reserved for search bulletins. She didn't know what she was hoping for, only that the fire was burning in the same range where her sister had disappeared. And deep down, she knew that mountains sometimes give back what they've taken, but only after they have been stripped bare. The wildfire had started with a lightning strike on a distant ridge, smoldering for days before a sudden shift in the wind pushed it downhill. By the time crews arrived in force, the flames were racing through the treetops, consuming acres of pine and aspen in a single night. Whole slopes glowed like embers, the air thick with ash that drifted for miles. Among the structures in its path was the old mountain retreat. Most of the guests had long since been evacuated, leaving the cabins empty and vulnerable. The main lodge caught first, its roof collapsing in a cascade of sparks that lit the sky. The smaller cabins followed, wood dry enough to burn hot and fast, leaving behind only blackened frames. When the fire finally relented, the retreat was little more than a skeleton of charred beams and warped metal. Crews moved through cautiously, searching for hot spots, their boots crunching over glass and debris. In what had once been Cabin 4, the floor had given way entirely, revealing a shallow crawl space beneath. The space was lined with scorched dirt and fragments of old insulation, but something glinted faintly in the soot. A firefighter knelt, brushing away ash with the back of his glove. Beneath the char, a section of the floor had been reinforced with boards different from the rest of the cabin. The nails were rusted, the wood aged and brittle, as if it had been hidden long before the fire ever touched it. With a few quick pulls, the boards came free, exposing a small hollow. Inside was a bundle wrapped in canvas, the fabric darkened by years of dust and heat. The firefighter hesitated before calling it in, his voice carrying across the ruin to the incident commander. Within minutes, law enforcement was on site, their radios crackling with terse instructions. Julia would not hear about the discovery for another 2 days. When she did, it came as a brief, almost clinical message from the county sheriff's office, telling her that something had been found beneath the burned remains of a cabin linked to her sister's disappearance. No details yet, they said, only that she might want to come in person. For the first time in years, Julia felt the mountain pulling her back, not with hope exactly, but with the promise of an answer that had been buried in silence, waiting for fire to force it into the open. Julia drove up the winding mountain road in a haze of exhaustion and disbelief. The sheriff's call had replayed in her mind since it came, her thoughts spiraling through every possible scenario. She had imagined bones, a scrap of clothing, or maybe a piece of jewelry that only she could identify. What she had not prepared for was the sight of the retreat itself, reduced to a scatter of blackened timbers against a backdrop of smoke-stained hills. The air was sharp with the scent of ash, a smell that clung to her clothes the moment she stepped out of the car. The sheriff met her near what had once been the main lodge, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He led her to the remains of Cabin 4 without speaking much, stepping carefully over fallen beams and splintered boards. The cabin's walls were gone, the floor a skeletal frame around a gaping hole in the center. Yellow tape fluttered in the mountain wind, cordoning off the area where the discovery had been made. Julia knelt near the edge, staring down into the shallow crawl space where the boards had been removed. A crime scene technician was crouched inside, photographing a small bundle wrapped in faded canvas. The fabric was stiff, its edges singed, but the shape beneath was rigid, unmistakable. Julia's throat tightened as the technician slowly unwrapped a corner to reveal the gleam of metal, a silver locket, tarnished but still intact. She knew it instantly. It had been their mother's, passed down to Samantha on her 25th birthday. The sheriff asked quietly if she wanted to confirm the identification. Julia nodded, her hands trembling as she took the locket. The clasp was stiff, but when it opened, the tiny photograph inside was still visible. It was a picture of the two of them, taken years ago on a hiking trip, cheeks flushed from the cold, hair tangled in the wind. Julia closed the locket and handed it back, her voice barely steady. She asked what else they had found, but the sheriff only said it was too early to know. The bundle would be taken to the lab for examination. As Julia stood there, looking at the blackened remains of the cabin, she realized the mountain had just spoken for the first time in 8 years. The question now was whether it was telling her the truth or only enough to keep her searching. The drive back to town felt longer than the climb into the mountains. Julia kept one hand on the wheel and the other wrapped tightly around her phone, as though the weight of it could anchor her in the present. She replayed every memory of Samantha at the retreat, trying to fit the image of that locket into the final hours anyone had seen her. The last time they had spoken, Samantha's voice had been light, almost teasing, as she described the quiet beauty of the place. There had been no hint of fear, no warning. The sheriff had arranged for her to stop by the county evidence facility that afternoon, just to review the photographs taken at the scene. Julia didn't know what she expected, perhaps a clearer look at the canvas bundle, something that would explain why it had been hidden beneath the cabin floor. When the images came up on the screen, they were stark and unflinching. The locket sat in the center of one frame, its chain coiled like a snake. In another, the bundle appeared heavier than she remembered, its corners squared, as if concealing something solid. A deputy standing nearby explained that they had also recovered small fragments of fabric from inside the canvas, along with a length of cord that had been knotted and frayed. Nothing could be confirmed yet, but the lab had already begun preliminary testing. The mention of the cord made Julia's stomach tighten. It was one thing to lose someone to the wilderness, to an accident, or a misstep in the dark. It was another to realize the mountain might have concealed something far more deliberate. Outside the building, the afternoon light was thin and cold. Julia stood in the parking lot for a long time, staring at the mountains in the distance. She thought about the wildfire, how it had torn through the retreat without mercy, and how it had unearthed what years of searching could not. It felt as though the mountain itself had finally grown tired of keeping its secrets. She got back into her car and started the engine, but her hands stayed on the wheel long after the motor turned over. Somewhere up there, beneath the ashes and the charred beams, the truth had shifted. And if the fire had revealed this much, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that it had left something even darker still buried in the smoke and ruin. Julia sat at her kitchen table that night, with the lights dimmed, the locket placed carefully in front of her. She had asked to keep it temporarily, knowing it would be taken back for further processing soon. Her fingers traced the familiar engraving on the back, the worn metal cool beneath her touch. It felt impossibly strange to have it here, in her home, after all these years of imagining it lost somewhere in the forest. She poured herself a cup of coffee, though she barely touched it, and opened a worn leather notebook she had started in the weeks after Samantha vanished. Inside were scribbled names, phone numbers, maps, and clippings from local newspapers. She flipped to the earliest entries, revisiting her own words from the time when she still believed Samantha might simply walk back through the door. Most of the names on those pages had long since stopped returning her calls. Friends from the retreat had moved away. Staff members from that summer could no longer be reached. But one name still stood out to her, underlined twice: Mark Ellison, the handyman who had been living on the grounds that season. He had been among the last to see Samantha, claiming he'd passed her near the dining hall before she went to her cabin. His statement had been vague, his tone oddly detached, but nothing had ever tied him directly to her disappearance. Julia stared at his name for a long time, tapping her pen against the table. If the locket had been hidden beneath the floor of a cabin, someone had put it there. And whoever that person was might have known enough to avoid suspicion. When her phone buzzed, it startled her. It was the sheriff's office again, this time with a short message that the lab results on the fabric and cord might be ready sooner than expected. Julia's pulse quickened. The thought of answers, no matter how grim, was both terrifying and necessary. She closed the notebook and slipped the locket back into its small evidence bag. Outside, the night was still and cold, the kind of mountain air that Samantha had always loved. Julia locked the door behind her, knowing that the road ahead would not just lead back to the Wildfire's ruins, but possibly to someone who had been living with the truth all this time. The next morning, Julia drove back toward the foothills, the thin ribbon of highway cutting through a haze that still lingered from the fire. Her thoughts circled relentlessly around the name she had underlined years ago: Mark Ellison. She had looked him up again the night before and found little an outdated address, a couple of mentions in local property records, and one blurry photograph from a community newsletter. He looked older, heavier, but there was no mistaking the same sharp eyes she remembered from the retreat. The sheriff's office was quieter than usual when she arrived, the hum of the vending machine the only sound in the lobby. Deputy Carver met her in the hallway and led her into a small room where a stack of manila folders sat on the table. He explained that the lab had returned preliminary findings on the items recovered from beneath the cabin floor. The fabric was identified as part of a linen garment, possibly a blouse, that matched the type Samantha was wearing in one of the last photographs taken of her. The cord was synthetic, the kind used for camping gear, and bore marks consistent with having been tightly knotted for an extended period. Julia listened without speaking, her hands folded so tightly in her lap her knuckles ached. Carver slid one of the folders toward her. Inside were close-up photographs of the fabric fibers and cord, each image more clinical than the last, but together they painted a picture she could not ignore. Whoever had placed those items under the floor had done so with intent. She asked if anyone had been contacted yet about the discovery. Carver hesitated before saying they were beginning to revisit interviews from the original investigation. That meant they would likely be speaking to Mark soon. The mention of his name made Julia's pulse kick up. She had questions for him that no detective could ask the same way she could. Outside, the wind carried the faint, acrid scent of burned wood. Julia walked to her car and rested her hand on the roof for a moment, staring toward the blackened hills. The fire had exposed what the earth had hidden, but she knew the truth would have to be pried from someone's memory. And if Mark Ellison still lived nearby, she intended to be the one to look him in the eye when those questions were asked. Julia found Mark Ellison's current address tucked away on a back road that wound through the lower slopes of the mountain. The small house was set behind a chain-link fence, its paint sun-faded and peeling, with an old truck parked out front. She sat in her car for a moment, watching the curtains twitch in one of the windows, wondering if he had already noticed her. The last time she had seen him, he had been wearing a tool belt and carrying a hammer, his stride slow but steady as he crossed the retreat's gravel paths. Now, as the front door creaked open, he looked older, with deep lines carved into his face and a wiry frame that seemed more fragile than she remembered. Still, his eyes were sharp and assessing as they settled on her. "Julia," he said, his voice carrying a faint rasp, "it's been a while." She stepped forward, feeling the uneven ground beneath her shoes. 8 years. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the mountain breeze rattling the branches overhead. She told him about the wildfire, about what had been found under the cabin floor, watching his reaction closely. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "That old place has been falling apart for years," he said. "Who knows what's been buried there?" Julia felt a chill run through her. He was careful, measured, speaking as if the details meant nothing to him. But there was something in the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of the door, tapping lightly as if trying to release nervous energy. "I remember you were one of the last people to see her," she said softly. "You told the police you saw her walking to her cabin." "That's what I saw," he replied quickly, maybe too quickly. The air between them felt heavy, as though both were holding back words they didn't want to say. She knew she would not get a confession here, not on his doorstep, but his guarded tone confirmed something for her. Mark Ellison was not simply a name in an old notebook. He was a thread worth pulling, no matter where it led. When she left, his eyes followed her until she turned the corner, disappearing from view. Julia gripped the steering wheel, her mind already racing toward her next move. The library smelled faintly of dust and old pine, the kind of place where time seemed to slow. Julia sat at one of the heavy oak tables, her laptop open beside a stack of brittle ledgers and manila folders. She had come here hoping to find records from the retreat's earliest years, anything that might tie Mark Ellison or the cabin to something darker. The retreat's guest logs were neatly handwritten, the looping script giving each name an air of importance. Samantha Roth's name appeared in the summer of 2012, marked with the date she arrived and the day she was last seen. Julia traced the ink with her finger, imagining her sister signing in, unaware it would be the last trace she left in an official record. A few pages earlier, Julia noticed Mark's name scattered across multiple years, not as a guest but as maintenance staff. The notes beside his entries were simple repairs completed, supplies delivered, but one notation caught her eye. It was dated just 3 days before Samantha vanished. "Special work at Cabin 6, it read. No details, no follow-up. She turned to the property maps and found that Cabin 6 was the same one destroyed in the wildfire. Her pulse quickened. That floor, that hidden trapdoor, and Mark's unexplained work, it was a chain she could not ignore. In the archives, she also found a faded envelope containing photographs of the retreat grounds during various events. One image stopped her cold. It showed a summer evening gathering, lanterns strung across the courtyard, guests mingling. In the far corner, just beyond the reach of the lights, stood Samantha. Beside her, barely visible, was Mark Ellison. His hand rested on her shoulder in a way that felt too familiar, his eyes fixed on her rather than the camera. Julia stared at the photo until the edges blurred. It was not proof, not yet, but it was something. As she packed her things, the librarian, an older woman with a soft voice, remarked, "Funny you're looking into that place now. People used to whisper about it. Said some cabins were never meant for guests." Julia carried the folders to her car, the words echoing in her mind. The picture, the notation, the whispered warnings, they were pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting 8 years to be solved. And now, the edges were starting to take shape. Rain began to fall as Julia pulled up the winding road to the remains of the retreat. The wildfire had left the once lush mountainside raw and scarred, its air still carrying the scent of burnt cedar. She stepped over charred beams and broken glass, guided by the narrow footpath that once led to Cabin 6. The ground was slick with ash and mud, the quiet broken only by the soft hiss of drizzle on the ruins. A yellow tarp flapped against the blackened foundation. Beneath it, A section of flooring had been pulled back to reveal the metal trapdoor she had seen in photographs. It was smaller than she expected, edges rimmed with rust, the handle warped by heat. A length of heavy chain had been looped through the latch, as if someone wanted to make certain it stayed closed. A county investigator knelt beside it, prying loose debris with a flat bar. He glanced up briefly. "We're still deciding how to proceed," he said, his tone cautious. "Fire exposed it, but whatever's inside hasn't seen daylight in a long time." Julia's eyes stayed fixed on the trapdoor. She imagined Samantha standing in this room 8 years ago, maybe laughing, maybe packing to leave. The thought twisted in her stomach. One of the firefighters who had first discovered it approached, brushing a streak of soot from his cheek. "It was buried under almost a foot of flooring and substructure," he explained. "Fire burned hot enough to weaken the boards, but not enough to touch whatever's under there." Julia crouched, reaching out to run her fingers over the cool, pitted metal. A faint smell seeped from the seams, something earthy and closed in, like air that had been trapped for years. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. The investigator straightened and began covering the trapdoor again. "We'll open it under controlled conditions," he said. "This isn't something we do out in the rain." Julia stepped back reluctantly, watching as the tarp was secured. The mountain seemed even quieter now, the kind of silence that swallows every sound. She knew she would not sleep until she saw inside that space. Driving away, the cabin's silhouette lingered in her rearview mirror, black against the mist. Whatever lay beneath that floor had survived fire, storms, and time itself. Soon, it would have to survive the truth. The following morning broke cold and pale, mist curling low over the mountains as the team gathered at the site. Julia stood back from the cabin's blackened shell, watching as the investigator and 2 deputies set up portable lights around the trapdoor. The charred wood creaked under their boots, every sound sharp in the stillness. One of the deputies snapped on a pair of gloves and began unlooping the heavy chain. It clinked against the rusted metal, each movement deliberate. The air smelled faintly of rain and smoke, with an undertone of something older, something that had been locked away for years. Julia's hands tightened around the notebook she carried, her breath shallow as the latch finally gave. The investigator gripped the warped handle and pulled. The hinges groaned, resisting at first before giving way in a shuddering scrape. A rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it a smell of damp earth and something metallic. The beam of a flashlight cut into the darkness below, revealing a narrow wooden ladder descending into a cramped, square space. Dust motes danced in the light as the first deputy climbed down. His voice drifted up, low and tense. "You're going to want to see this." Julia edged closer, peering down as the flashlight beam swept over the contents. Against the far wall sat an old trunk, its brass fittings tarnished and lid secured with a simple latch. Beside it was a small folding chair and what looked like a bundle of blankets, discolored with age. The deputy reached for the latch, but the investigator stopped him, kneeling to take photographs first. When the trunk was finally opened, the metallic click of the latch seemed to echo in the tiny chamber. Inside, neatly folded clothes lay on top, the colors muted by years in the dark. A scarf lay coiled like it had been placed there yesterday, its pale blue fabric shockingly untouched by decay. Underneath, the glint of something small and silver caught the light. The deputy lifted it out, revealing a delicate necklace with a heart-shaped pendant, its surface scratched but still intact. Julia felt the air shift around her as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. That necklace had belonged to Samantha Roth. She remembered seeing it in old photographs, a constant against every changing backdrop of her life. Now it had surfaced from the shadows, and with it came the undeniable sense that the rest of the truth was finally within reach. The necklace lay in an evidence bag on the table, its pale metal dulled by scratches yet still catching the faint light from the single window. Julia sat across from Detective Marlowe in the ranger station's small conference room, the hum of a space heater filling the pauses between their words. Her eyes kept drifting to the pendant, memories tugging at her until the present felt thin. She remembered Samantha wearing it on the last morning they had spoken, idly spinning it between her fingers as she poured coffee. Marlowe leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. He had a folder open, pages fanned out to reveal photographs of the cabin floor, the trapdoor, and the chamber below. "The clothes in the trunk are consistent with the year Samantha disappeared," he said quietly. "And the scarf matches the one she was last seen wearing. But that's not all. We found something else under the blankets." He slid a second photograph toward her. It showed a slim, leather-bound journal, its cover worn to a soft sheen. Julia's breath caught. She had seen it before, in Samantha's bag, the summer she had gone to the retreat. "That's hers," Julia whispered. The detective nodded. "It's locked, but there's no sign of water damage. We'll have our forensic team open it. If there are entries from those final days, it might tell us who she was with and why she didn't come home." Julia's gaze shifted back to the pendant. The weight of its presence, after all these years, was almost unbearable. "She wouldn't have left that behind willingly," she said, her voice unsteady. "If it's here, so was she. That means she was inside that cabin, maybe for a long time." Marlowe's expression was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something heavier. "That's the question we're asking now," he replied. "Who kept her there? And why did they make sure no one found out?" Outside, wind moved through the blackened trees, rattling loose branches like brittle bones. Julia closed her eyes for a moment, the image of her sister's smile burning against the darkness. The fire had stripped the mountain bare, but what it revealed was only the beginning. Somewhere, in the ash and ruin, Samantha's voice was waiting to be heard again. The journal sat on the evidence table like a sealed vault, its small brass clasp tarnished but intact. Julia stood beside it, her arms folded tightly, as if bracing for the weight of whatever might spill from its pages. Detective Marlowe gestured toward the technician who had been carefully working with precision tools. With a soft click, the clasp gave way, and the leather creaked as the cover slowly opened. The first page was dated 2 weeks before Samantha's disappearance. The handwriting was unmistakable, small, looping letters that leaned slightly to the right. Julia reached out, her fingers hovering just above the paper before she let them fall back to her side. Marlowe began to read aloud, his voice steady but quiet, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. Samantha's words painted a picture of the retreat as a place that seemed calm on the surface but carried an undercurrent she could not ignore. She wrote of staff members who avoided certain parts of the property after dark, of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. Halfway through the journal, the tone shifted. Samantha described a man she had met there, someone she initially thought was another guest, but later suspected had authority over the place. Her entries hinted at fear, but also at a determination to uncover something she felt was being hidden. On the final dated page, she wrote of hearing footsteps outside her cabin late at night, followed by a knock she did not answer. The next line ended mid-sentence, the pen stroke trailing off into nothing. Julia felt her throat tighten as Marlowe closed the journal. "There's no entry after that night," he said, glancing at her. "If we can identify this man, we might finally know what happened to her." Outside the station window, twilight was settling over the mountains, the charred tree line etched sharply against the fading light. Julia thought about how the fire had peeled back the years like layers of bark, exposing the truth one blackened piece at a time. The journal was more than just a record of Samantha's last days. It was a breadcrumb trail left in ink instead of crumbs, waiting for someone to follow it to the end. The photograph lay beneath the harsh fluorescent light, its edges curled from years of being hidden away. Julia stared at it without speaking, her breath catching in her throat. Samantha was in the center, smiling, but it was not the casual joy of a holiday snapshot. There was tension in her eyes, a stiffness in her shoulders. Around her, several people she did not recognize stood in front of the retreat's main lodge. Marlowe slid a magnifying glass across the table. "Look here," he said, tapping the far left edge of the image. A man stood slightly apart from the others, partially obscured by shadow. His stance was rigid, his head turned just enough to reveal a sharp profile and eyes fixed not on the camera but directly on Samantha. The expression was unreadable, but it carried an unmistakable intensity. Julia felt a chill despite the warm room. "That's him," she whispered, not fully sure why she knew. There was no name yet, but her gut told her this was the man Samantha had written about in her journal. The unease in her sister's final entries seemed to echo in the tilt of his head, the way his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. Marlowe nodded slowly, his mind already moving ahead. "If we can place him on the staff roster from that year, we'll have a lead. Maybe more than that." He pulled another folder toward him, revealing a list of former employees, some of the names crossed out with notes in the margins. Outside, rain had begun to patter softly against the window, a gentle sound that contrasted with the electric tension in the room. Julia leaned closer to the photograph, her eyes tracing every detail: the uneven gravel in the lodge driveway, the faint blur of a weathered sign in the background, the way Samantha's arm seemed to hang awkwardly at her side, as though she had been interrupted just before the shutter clicked. It was only a single image, but it carried the weight of everything Julia had feared. Somewhere in the grain of that photograph lay the truth, frozen in time, waiting for them to strip away the shadows. She did not yet know the man's name, but she could feel that once they did, the real story of what happened to her sister would begin to take shape. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of scorched wood and damp earth. The wildfire had stripped away the outer walls, leaving only the skeletal remains of what once stood. Julia knelt near the corner where the floorboards had buckled and warped under the heat. Marlowe crouched beside her, pulling away the brittle planks until the dark soil beneath was exposed. At first, it looked like nothing more than a pocket of ash and dirt. Then Julia's eyes caught the edge of something pale against the blackened ground. Marlowe brushed at it carefully, his gloved hand slow and deliberate. The object emerged inch by inch, a corner of fabric, frayed and charred, but patterned faintly with faded blue flowers. Julia's breath caught. She remembered that pattern. It had been on the summer dress Samantha wore the last time she called home. Marlowe glanced up at her, his eyes grim but steady. "It's been buried here a long time." He continued to clear the dirt until the rest of the dress appeared, twisted into a shape that told its own silent story. Beneath it, the soil gave way to a smaller compartment, an old wooden crate, its lid warped from years of damp and heat. The hinges gave a reluctant groan as Marlowe lifted it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of papers and photographs. Julia reached for the top one, her fingers trembling. It was a picture of the cabin as it once was, before the fire, taken from the same angle she stood now. Only in this photograph, a figure stood in the doorway, the same man from the lodge picture. The silence between them deepened, filled only by the crackle of cooling embers outside. Julia felt the weight of the years pressing down, the stubborn truth that had waited in the dark for nearly a decade. Someone had hidden this here, knowing it might never be found. She traced the man's face in the photograph, her throat tight. "He was here the whole time," she said softly, as though speaking it aloud would make the truth less impossible. Marlowe closed the crate gently. "Now we know where to start looking," he replied, but Julia could feel they were standing at the edge of something far more dangerous than either of them had imagined. The lodge's small office smelled faintly of cedar and dust, as if time had sealed it in a forgotten bubble. Julia stood by the filing cabinets while Marlowe worked through a stack of brittle guest logs on the desk. The old ledgers, their pages yellowed and curling, bore careful handwritten entries, each name inked in looping cursive. She scanned the columns, her pulse quickening when she found Samantha's signature dated the week she disappeared. Just below it, in a smaller, slanted script, was another name she did not recognize, accompanied by a cabin number and a note reading, "Extended Stay." Marlowe leaned over her shoulder. That name show up anywhere else? She flipped through the following weeks, and there it was again, always in the same cabin, always paid in cash. It was a pattern that made her stomach twist. Whoever it was had been here long enough to notice Samantha, long enough to watch her routines. Julia set the logbook aside and sifted through a box of miscellaneous lodge paperwork. At the bottom, she found an envelope brittle from age. Inside was a series of candid photographs, the colors muted with time. One image stopped her cold Samantha, standing near the railing of the lodge's upper deck, her hair caught in the mountain wind, her smile easy. In the blurry foreground, a man's shoulder filled the corner of the frame as though the photo had been taken from just behind him. The office felt smaller now, the shadows longer, the air heavier. Julia studied the man's jacket in the photograph, its worn leather distinctive enough to recognize if she ever saw it again. She imagined him lingering at the edges, capturing moments that were never meant to be his. Marlowe took the photo, turning it under the light. "We need to know who took this," he said, his voice low but resolute. Julia nodded, but the unease in her chest was growing. It was not just about uncovering a stranger's identity anymore. The longer they searched, the more it felt like they were pressing against the thin veil of a story that someone had worked hard to bury. And, with each page they turned and each photograph they uncovered, she could not shake the feeling that this person might still be watching, even now. The wind had shifted since morning, carrying the faint scent of charred wood from the ridge above. Julia followed Marlowe up the scorched slope, their boots sinking into the damp ash. The wildfire had moved through this section quickly, leaving behind skeletal trees and a lattice of blackened soil. What had been thick undergrowth was now an open scar, revealing parts of the land that had likely gone unseen for decades. Near the base of an old pine stump, something pale caught Julia's eye. She crouched, brushing away the ashy debris until her fingers closed around a jagged scrap of painted wood. The green paint was chipped, but still vivid in places, its color unnatural against the muted ruin of the forest floor. Marlowe joined her, his brow furrowing as he turned it in his hands. "This isn't from the lodge," he said, his voice certain. A few yards uphill, they found more fragments, splintered planks, rusted nails, and a warped metal latch. Julia's pulse quickened as she realized the wildfire had stripped away the earth's covering, exposing what looked like the remains of a small outbuilding. Its footprint was barely visible, just a shallow depression now, but the shape was deliberate. She stepped carefully inside the outline, imagining walls where the air now hung open. In one corner, half buried beneath clumps of blackened roots, her boot struck something solid. She knelt, scraping at the soil, until the curve of a glass jar emerged. Inside, through a haze of dirt and condensation, were slips of folded paper, some yellowed, others bleached white. Marlowe took the jar and held it up to the thin sunlight. "These were hidden here," he murmured, almost to himself. The papers inside looked fragile enough to crumble at a touch, yet their presence felt heavy, deliberate, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure they would remain undiscovered. Julia's stomach knotted as she imagined Samantha's neat handwriting filling those pages, or worse, someone else's words that could explain the years of silence. The forest around them was eerily still, the only sound, the occasional pop of cooling embers. As they wrapped the jar in cloth, Julia glanced over her shoulder. The wildfire had revealed this place by accident, but it was not chance that had put it here. Whoever hid these papers had done so believing the mountain would keep its secrets. Now, for the first time in 8 years, that trust had been broken. The jar sat between them on the rough kitchen table of the ranger station, its glass clouded with decades of dirt and moisture. Julia watched as Marlowe eased the rusted lid free, the metal groaning in protest before giving way with a sharp twist. A faint, musty smell drifted out, like the inside of a long-forgotten attic. He reached in carefully, drawing out the first slip of paper, its edges curled and brittle. The ink had bled in places, but most of the words were still legible. They were short notes, written in a hurried hand, some smudged as if from rain or tears. The first was dated just 2 days before Samantha vanished, describing strange sounds outside the cabin at night and a feeling of being watched. The second spoke of an argument with someone unnamed, a confrontation Samantha seemed to fear escalating. Julia's hands tightened in her lap as Marlowe unfolded another. This one was different, more precise, almost clinical, detailing a meeting arranged at a clearing near the ridge. It included a time and a description of an object Samantha intended to bring, something she believed could end the threats for good. No object was named, but the tone was unmistakable. She was preparing for a final step, one she never returned from. There were more, some fragmented, others strangely cryptic, referencing places on the mountain Julia had never heard of. Each note deepened the unease coiling in her chest. These were not random scraps, they were a trail of breadcrumbs Samantha had tried to leave, only for them to be buried until now. Marlowe leaned back, his eyes narrowing in thought. She knew something was coming, he said quietly, and she was scared enough to hide the truth where no one would ever think to look. Julia felt a shiver despite the stove's steady heat. The wildfire had uncovered the jar, but the words inside had the weight of a confession. Every page hinted at someone who had walked freely in the years since, someone who had been here on this mountain and might still be watching from the shadows. As the last slip was placed gently back into the jar, Julia knew they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer searching for pieces of a mystery, they were standing inside it. And the answers they sought might already be closer than they dared imagine. Night had fallen over the ridge, leaving the world outside the ranger station in near total darkness. The wildfire had long since moved on, leaving only smoldering patches in the distance and the faint scent of burnt pine drifting through the air. Inside, the jar of notes sat between Julia and Marlowe like an unspoken challenge. Each fragile page hinted at meetings, threats, and a final act that had never been completed. Marlowe had spread a map of the mountain across the table, the edges held down by his coffee mug and a small lantern. He began marking the locations Samantha had mentioned, connecting them with thin pencil lines. Julia leaned over, tracing the paths with her eyes, recognizing only a few places she had hiked as a child, places she never thought would hold significance. But then her gaze fell on one she had never visited, a hollow marked by a faded name, Blackwood Clearing. The note suggested Samantha had arranged to meet someone there on her last night. The time was written clearly, but the name of the person was replaced by a single initial, an M. Julia's stomach tightened. Marlowe's jaw set as if the letter meant something to him, but he said nothing at first. "You know who it is," she pressed. His pause was brief, but telling. "I have a suspicion," he replied, his tone low. "And if I'm right, we're dealing with someone who has managed to stay invisible for a very long time." Julia felt a heaviness settle over her. The idea that Samantha might have trusted this person enough to meet them alone in the middle of the woods was unsettling. The thought that this person could still be nearby, still walking the same trails, made her pulse quicken. They decided they would hike to Blackwood Clearing at first light. Marlowe wanted to arrive quietly, without alerting anyone who might still be watching. The mountain, stripped bare in parts by the fire, had an exposed, raw quality now, as if its secrets were less hidden but somehow more dangerous. Before turning in for the night, Julia picked up the jar one more time. The glass felt cool, almost damp, and inside, the curled notes shifted with the slightest movement. She realized she was holding the last words of a woman who had known her fate might be sealed before sunrise 8 years ago. The weight of that knowledge made it harder to breathe. Tomorrow, they would follow her trail into the dark. The morning air clung cold and sharp to Julia's skin as she followed Marlowe along the narrow trail. The forest was still waking, the charred trees standing like blackened sentinels against the pale light of dawn. Every step toward Blackwood Clearing felt heavier than the last, as though the mountain itself was testing her resolve. The silence between them was deliberate. Words felt too fragile to carry the weight of what they might find. When they finally emerged into the clearing, Julia stopped. The space was smaller than she imagined, ringed by skeletal pines and littered with ash. Yet there was a strange symmetry to it, as if someone had once tended this ground. Marlowe walked slowly, scanning the perimeter, his eyes catching on a low mound near the base of a half-burned tree. It looked like nothing more than a patch of disturbed earth, but the way it curved unnaturally made Julia's heart lurch. Marlowe knelt, brushing away loose ash until the edge of something pale emerged beneath his fingers. It was wood, weathered and splintering, with a rusted hinge clinging stubbornly to one side. The two of them exchanged a glance, and without speaking, Marlowe pulled a small pry-bar from his pack. The wood gave with a reluctant groan, releasing a stale, trapped breath of air from whatever had been sealed inside for years. Beneath the lid lay a small tin box, its once bright paint dulled and flaking. Julia's hands trembled as she lifted it free, the metal icy despite the growing warmth of the morning. When she opened it, the smell of damp paper and faint traces of smoke rose up. Inside were photographs, their edges curled, showing the same mountain paths they had just walked, but with faces, Samantha's among them, smiling, her arm around people Julia didn't recognize. Folded between the photos was a letter, its ink blurred in places, but still legible. The words were simple and chilling. "If you're reading this, then I didn't make it down." Julia's breath caught. There was more, hints of betrayal, a plea to trust no one except a name hastily scrawled at the bottom. Marlowe stared at it for a long moment before closing his eyes, as though the recognition came with a burden too great to speak aloud. The clearing seemed to grow quieter around them, the weight of 8 years pressing in from every direction. Whatever had begun here had not ended, and Julia could feel it waiting. The cabin stood in ruin, its charred beams jutting toward the overcast sky like the ribs of some ancient creature. Julia stepped carefully over the blackened threshold, the scent of wet ash mixing with the faint sweetness of decayed wood. Marlowe was already inside, crouched low near what had once been the main room, his gloved hands brushing aside brittle debris. The wildfire had stripped away layers of time, revealing more than anyone had expected. Beneath the warped planks, a section of floor had collapsed entirely, exposing a narrow cavity. The edges were lined with soot, but inside, something pale and rigid caught the weak light filtering through the broken roof. Julia knelt beside him, her pulse quickening as the shape became clearer, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, edges stiff with age. They worked in silence, lifting it free with slow precision. The cloth peeled away reluctantly, and inside lay a collection of items, each one telling its own fractured story. There was a wool scarf, stained and stiff, the same color Samantha had been wearing in the last known photograph of her. A cracked leather journal rested beneath it, its pages warped from years of hidden damp. The handwriting inside was unmistakable, small, deliberate strokes, each word etched as though its writer had known it might be their last record. The entries were fragmented, some nothing more than single sentences, mentions of feeling watched, strange noises outside the cabin at night, plans to leave before he returned. Julia's stomach tightened at the final page, where the writing stopped mid-line, the pen stroke trailing into nothing. At the bottom of the bundle was a Polaroid, its image ghostly but still distinct. It showed Samantha standing on the porch of the cabin, her smile faint, her eyes turned toward someone just beyond the frame. The reflection in the cabin window behind her caught Julia's attention, a blurred but unmistakable silhouette, broad-shouldered, wearing a cap pulled low. Marlowe held the photograph between his fingers for a long moment before sliding it into a protective sleeve. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke, but there was an edge to it that Julia had never heard before. "This wasn't random," he said. "Someone planned for her never to leave this place." Outside, the wind rose, stirring the ash into thin spirals that drifted upward, as if the mountain itself was exhaling secrets it had kept for far too long. The trial drew the small mountain town into a tense orbit, each day peeling back another layer of a truth that had festered for years. The man in the defendant's chair, once a respected retreat caretaker, sat rigid as witnesses spoke of his charm masking a darker control. The prosecution laid out the chain of events with surgical precision, how Samantha had planned to leave, how her belongings were hidden beneath the cabin, and how the wildfire had exposed what he believed would remain buried forever. Julia sat in the second row, the Polaroid sealed in its evidence bag resting on the table before her. She had stared at it countless times, always returning to that blurred reflection in the cabin window. It was not only proof of presence, it was proof of intent. The jury leaned forward when the photograph was enlarged and projected, the once innocent image now carrying the weight of premeditation. When the verdict was read, the air seemed to shift, guilty on all counts. The words landed with a quiet finality, not the rush of triumph Julia might have expected, but a heavy acknowledgement of what had been taken and could never be returned. Samantha's sister, who had come to court for every session, closed her eyes and exhaled as though she had been holding her breath for 8 years. After the courtroom emptied, Julia drove up the mountain one last time. The retreat was gone, nothing but a scorched clearing now, ringed by pines whose bark still bore the fire's kiss. She stood where the cabin once stood, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and thought about how nature had been both a silent witness and, in the end, the hand that revealed the truth. She unfolded a copy of Samantha's last journal page, the one where the ink trailed off mid-thought. For a moment, Julia let herself imagine what might have followed if Samantha had escaped that night, the life she could have built, the paths she might have taken. But some questions, she knew, would always remain suspended in the space between fact and what could have been. As the sun sank behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the clearing, Julia whispered a quiet promise into the wind. Samantha's story was no longer hidden in the dark. It would live in the light, carried forward by those who refused to let her be forgotten.